Thanks very much, Fiona. So quick note, it is actually the Google SLSA framework, not an SLA framework. The framework is about securing artifacts in your CI/CD in order to prevent supply chain attacks. And we really applaud Google for attempting to take the lead on what we think is largely an unmet need in application security. From our perspective, it's actually the greatest unmet need in application security. So we think Google should really be commended for their efforts. But it's also worth noting that the effort that Google has put in here is about one specific part of the SDLC. And if you're looking to increase the security of your software supply chain, there are some pieces that are out of the SLSA framework scope. So that's what we wanted to talk about here today. But before we get into that, I wanted to spend a couple minutes talking about how we got here. Next slide, please. So I don't think it'll shock anyone that many are calling 2021 the year of the software supply chain attack. There have been more attacks that are more severe than any other year in the history of software supply chain attacks. Next slide, please. And it goes beyond the headlines. The EU the European Union Security Organization has demonstrated that the increases are actually up 4x from 2020 to 2021. And Gartner is, you mind clicking one more time?
Yeah.
And Gartner is actually predicting that these changes will continue to, or that the increase will continue to accelerate into 2025, when almost half of organizations will have software supply chain attacks occurring in that year. So the point of this is that it's not just headlines. The frequency and the severity is increasing to the point where everybody needs to start thinking about, how am I going to protect my software supply chain? And that's where Google SLSA framework comes in. It's an approach to how should we do that, because it's an area that many organizations hadn't really dealt with in the past. Next slide, please. So the big change that we think is occurring is that in the past, attackers were primarily going after production applications, but now they're actually going after the tools that make up your CI/CD pipelines, your software delivery pipelines, and that's a big shift. Next slide. So why is that happening? One more. So we think there are three fundamental problems with software supply chain security. The first is a visibility issue, and I think it's important to recognize that most security teams are actually not responsible for the key tools that make up the software delivery pipeline. We've done some surveying, and in general, about 80% of security teams are not responsible for securing GitHub. They're not responsible for securing Jenkins, JFrog, the cloud environment, or infrastructure as code. The responsibility for the security tends to fall with DevOps or with the software development team. And while that's great, generally speaking, a software development team is going to set up their software delivery tools with an emphasis based on efficiency and developer agility. And at times that comes at the expense of security. And maybe for good reason, but we think that security needs to find ways to be able to be more part of that conversation to help to determine when and where security should be applied, and ideally when and where it can be applied in a silent way. So next, please. So the big thing to note here is that the tools themselves have become attack vectors. Attackers are starting to shift on attempting to compromise developer accounts as one of the key ways to get into a software development lifecycle. And all of the amazing enhancements that we've made in terms of automating DevOps, that is actually facilitating lateral movement of attackers just as much as it's actually increasing efficiency in our SDLC. So we've created new attack surfaces, and we've actually made it easier for attackers to get in one place and then own the entire cycle. And next. And lastly, there aren't really tools that are set up to think about security this way. There's lots of tools to secure source code in the sense of finding vulnerabilities within it, whether it's a 0-day or a CVE. And there's lots of tools out there to try and protect the application in the production environment. But what about protecting the software supply chain itself? Not a lot exists. So let's go to the next slide. And then the point here is that our software development life cycles are becoming so much easier to own when you break in one particular place. And there's no better example of that than source control management systems. If you think about the evolution of what's been happening in source control management systems, 10 years ago, really the only thing that we had in our repositories was source code. But today we store so much more in our repos that once we're giving an attacker access to that repository, we're giving them the ability to really own the entire SDLC. What do we mean by that? So let's think about something like GitHub Actions. GitHub Actions are effectively CI/CD configurations. So if I've got access to GitHub and I can manipulate the actions, then I can trigger a new build. We also have infrastructure as code that's being stored in the repository. So not only can I trigger a new build, but I can potentially take that new build and deploy it into production. And then, of course, because of the source code, I can tamper with the code. So if I can get in and own a source control management system, I can potentially own the entire SDLC. Next slide, please. And this is where I'll pass it off to Ronen, who's going to now talk in a little more detail about Google's SLSA framework. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. So yes, Andrew mentioned all the issues with the software supply chain. And in June this year, almost 6 months ago, Google announced the SLSA framework. So SLSA is a supply chain level for software artifacts. It's basically an end-to-end framework for ensuring the integrity of software artifacts through the software supply chain, where the goal is to improve the state of the industry, especially it is aimed at open source to defend against sort of this the most pressing integrity threats, as we saw in the first slide. And basically, SLSA is focused more on the process of building and shipping code, and not on the content that goes through the pipeline itself. So we will talk about it also in this presentation. So at its basics, the SLSA framework offers 4 different levels of SLSA, where the first level, level 0, means that you provide no guarantee at all. The first level means that the build process is fully scripted, automated, and it generates provenance. The second means that you, in addition to the level 1, you also require, you're also using version control, and you use a hosted build service to generate the provenance. At the third level, there are more specific standards that guarantee audit and the integrity of the generated provenance. And in the fourth level, mainly it requires 2-person reviews and hermetic reproducible builds, which we'll also touch in later slides. So this is sort of a more simple explanation, again, of the 4 different levels. So level 1 means basically that you document the build process. So the example would be unsigned provenance. The second level means that you're tamper resistant in the build service. So this would be if you sign the provenance and you use a hosted source and build. Level 3 means that you're extra resistant to some specific threats. So this would be security controls on the host and non-falsible provenance. And 4 would be the highest level of confidence, which means a 2-party review and hermetic builds. And then the SLSA framework also offers some kind of threat model for the software delivery pipeline. We can see it divided into source integrity and build integrity, where the threats in the source part would be someone submitting bad code, so either through compromising a developer or compromising the tool. This will be also the second threat, compromised source control. And then we can also see the threats that exist in the build phases. We'll elaborate on these more. Then the framework sort of takes the takes the different stages and divides the requirements into 4 categories, 4 broader categories. Source, which is focused on the source code management platform and the management around the source code. Build, which talks about the build tools that you use. Provenance, which is sort of the certificate that you will get out of the build service that proves the various steps and things that you did or claim that you did in the build. And then common, which would be controls that are relevant to all the tools that are used as part of the process. And there is this high-level chart that shows you what are the requirements that you need to comply with, and then which SLSA level you are entitled to if you comply with these requirements. So let's look at the source. Basically, four requirements. If you're using a source control that is a version control, so this entitled SLSA 2, or this is the requirement of SLSA 2. If the history can be verified, so each change can be tied to an authenticated user, and we can verify that indeed this is the contributor. So this would entitle SLSA 3. And then if the history is retained indefinitely, and if you enforce a 2% reviews, so these are the extra requirements for SLSA level 4. But then SLSA also talks about some use cases that would be out of scope for the standard. So the first one would be if 2 people collude to perform some malicious activity, meaning they agree to do it. Someone opens a pull request, the other person approves it. So here probably the first line of defense would be using this privilege and really narrowing the risks against that. Trick reviewer into approving bad code, like we saw recently with the Trojan source attack. So probably the best mitigation here would be to have some tool that able to identify it and assist reviewers in this process. Reviewers that blindly approve changes, obviously this is not something can happen, and this is something that can be detected from looking at the activity within the source control. How long was the pull request open? Does it have any comments and things like that? And then if we talk about compromise of the entire source control system, like for example, if you self-host the source control and there's a vulnerability in the version that you use, so this is against, it means that the entire tool is controlled by an attacker, and then you can trust the data that comes from the SCM, but commit signing at the developer level could be something that can be used as a mitigation here. And then another issue is admin activity. So obviously people have admin access to these tools. And for example, what happens if an owner or an admin removes a restriction, pushes code, and then brings these restrictions back? So this is again something that is not covered here and should be complemented with other tools. Then we move to the core of SLSA, which is the build process, which again has various requirements to achieve different levels of SLSA in the build tool that you use. For example, do you use a script to do the build? Do you use a dedicated service? Is the environment of the build an ephemeral environment? Are the builds themselves isolated from each other? Is the build parameterless? Do you use an hermetic build? And finally, there's this notion of reproducible builds, which is not a SLSA requirement, but is a very strong mitigation and can be used to, and should be used to detect, mitigate this risk of software supply chain. And then as part of the build phase, you need to provide provenance. This is also a basic requirement of SLSA. So to achieve level 1, you need to have some available provenance that you can supply. This provenance is basically like a certification that describes the different build phases and what are the steps that were taken, what is the code that was built. So according to how strong this provenance is, you can achieve higher levels of SLSA. So if it can be authenticated, if it was generated by a service, if it's something that cannot be falsified by the build service users, and if it provides a complete list of the dependencies and their exact version and that entered to the build process. The framework also describes like what are the what is the content that should be within the provenance that is eventually generated. So obviously identifying the artifacts that were produced, what is the builder, what is the source that built it, what is the entry point that starts the execution. It has all the build parameters if the build requires one, all the dependencies, and if a reproducible build is possible, so a reproducible build info, and metadata, which is again another additional requirement and is not part of the 4 level of SLSA. So this is a basic example of SLSA. I won't dive into it, but basically it shows the example of a builder that downloads a tar.gz archive that has code in it, extracts it, compiles it using make with C flags, and it results with a file with a hash of 5678. So this is an example of how it should look when it is done using the InToto framework, which is also an open source project aimed at this specific issue. So how the scope for build and provenance would be. So if we look at the thread, so if the build is done from unofficial sources, like a fork of a repository, some side branch, unknown tag, or something like that, so this would be TBD in the threads, and basically this should be part of the provenance, and this should be verified as part of the provenance to mitigate against this as well. Then if we talk about compromise the build, so compromise build tools. So there's again all kinds of scenario. It could be an admin of the tool, an owner, a cache poisoning, or a CV in the tool itself. So if someone compromises the build platform, so again this is out of scope, and sort of the build controls that are described within the framework are there to to require the use of a very strong build system that would be harder to compromise and would be harder to gain persistence over. Then if we still want to address this build of a compromised build tools, so a reproducible build, which is the best effort in the standard, would offer some mitigation around it. Because if you can do two different builds in 2 different tools and then compare them against each other, you would detect a compromised build tool. The last part of the framework is common control. These are the common requirements that should be used in every trusted system that is involved in your software supply chain. So the code, the build, and the distribution tool. And sort of the requirements are to have the system meet some security baseline. This is yet to be determined. Have a strong access control over these tools, log the access, and use third-party multi-factor authentication, and minimize the amount of administrator and people that have admin access to all these tools. Again, because we saw previously the threats that sort of derive from having users with this high privilege. Then if we talk about some more issues that are out of scope, that are more common, so obviously crypto hash collisions, this would be out of scope for SLSA and are not discussed. Also, the framework doesn't look at what goes into the software delivery pipeline, so vulnerability in code or dependency vulnerabilities or infrastructure as code are not explicitly part of the framework, and they should be checked individually. And then the framework again focuses on the build and code phases, getting the artifacts prepared, and then the missing piece would be looking at the production environment, looking at production exposure and misconfiguration, and continuously checking the provenance that was created in the build phase, and checking it against the actual pieces of code that are running or distributed, and make sure that it all aligns. And then finally, the issue of a secret exposure. So again, not mentioned specifically in the standard, but again, could have a major effect on the security of the software supply chain, depending on which secret is exposed. But basically, this could be giving access to the tools themselves, bringing back all the threats that we talked about earlier, as well as access to the production, which we talked about here. So let's move to some Q&A.